Hello, it's Jason with a special episode for you today about an upcoming bass event, online bass event like bass events are these days. And this is from Sara Neilson. You can find her website, contrabasic.com. I'll link up to this, and I will link up to her beginner summer camp page, which is happening July 6th through the 30th. And this is super cool. This is for ages 8 to 12. Now, Sara does many things in the world of music and the world of bass, teaches at the Merit School of Music in Chicago, which we talk about on this episode. It's a wonderful place with a wonderful mission. She's definitely an expert bass teacher, both for beginning bassists and any level, but this camp focused on beginning bassists, ages 8 to 12. How cool is that? And Sara's been on the podcast, actually, on a panel discussion from the Chicago Bass Festival from a few years back. I will link up to that, her website, her Facebook, where she has been doing these live morning warm-ups, which is super cool. And when we were talking, I think it was the 60th day, and I'll link up to her Instagram. So definitely follow along with Sara and be sure to check out this camp. So here's my talk with Sara. Are you still keeping the students that you had more or less through all this, or what are you up to?
Sort of. A large part of my work is through the Merit School of Music. Mm-hmm. And because the students we serve are largely in CPS schools, and many of those kids don't even have or did not even have an internet connection when this all started, that was a little bit of a challenge to keep in touch and keep teaching them. And then, some of my students dropped off just, out of financial necessity or just too much going on. The bass was not their first priority, but, I have a few who've really stuck with it and have seen a good amount of growth. And, we've done an online studio class and stuff for them. They've kind of all gotten to meet each other now where they are far enough away from each other that wouldn't have been something I could have offered in person. So in some ways, and I'm sure you've seen on Facebook, I'm doing this warm-up class every morning still.
That's every single morning you're doing that?
Every weekday.
Wow.
9:30. And I think today was class number 62. So that tells you how long we've been at this, right? So
wow.
It gives me some accountability too, where some days I would probably not get in the practice room until the afternoon. I'm doing something in the morning at least, and reminding myself of those good habits for whenever we can get back to playing and all that. So.
Now, had you done a lot of online teaching before this all broke out, or was this kind of a new thing for you?
I did a little bit of online. I've had a few online students here and there over the years, mostly beginners, various ages, just adults who didn't have a teacher in their area, or I somehow came up in a Google search and, a parent contacted me for their kid. So, I've done a little bit of that over the years, but I think the pandemic is forcing us all to be a little bit more creative just with how we teach.
Yeah, well, it's been interesting because I've talked to a few people that's, teach. I don't really teach that much these days. I have a whopping 2 students, I think, or 1.5 students or something like that. But I was talking to Andrew Goyens, who's a bass teacher down in the Dallas area, and just talking about his experience getting used to this, or people, at different levels. And is there any, obviously there's some major downsides at any age, but particularly with the younger crowd, the more beginner crowd. But is there any silver lining or any positive you're finding? Is there anything that on the positive side that you found through this? Obviously, we can think of a lot of frustrations, but
Um, I'm sure there are positives. I think with like the students who haven't been note reading very well, like we've been able to do like focus on that a lot more than I might normally, because in an in-person setting, I'm really like zeroed in on their right arm, and I think sometimes I what I think is a fluke in terms of note reading it may be more than that, and that's kind of been revealed to me just through this medium. I think it's harder to play games, but I did come up with a really great game for the beginners. And so what you need is a pencil and you need a balloon. You blow the, and you have to make your bow hold on your pencil, and you have to use the pencil to keep the balloon in the air. But you are not allowed to take a step, and you are not allowed to have a bad bow hold. And they really are enjoying that. I know it sounds like the most ridiculous, but you know, you're just trying to get them to control that that right hand in a way that is more fun than, you know, getting them to do it 1,000 times on the bass. And
yeah,
once they've mastered it with the pencil, then you can move up to like either a marker if you need like an intermediate stage, or you can go straight to the bow and have them do it with the bow. But the bow is a lot heavier, and so that's where you kind of see like the weird thumb habits kind of come out, where the thumb is kind of bent back, or you see like I see this bow hold often enough, where the you know, the first finger's like pointing toward at the tip of the bow, and I don't teach that, but so just kind of using that as a way to break any habits that might have emerged and still keep it fun. And some kids will do that for like 5-6 minutes out of their half-hour lesson, and I think that's a really good thing. And hopefully they're also like practicing that after their lesson.
Yeah, it's such a tough thing to solve when you're actually holding the bow, because of its on, you know, weightiness, I guess, you know, like they're holding the bow in the air is just kind of problematic unless it's straight up, because you get
and that's what I ran into the same thing. And you know, I think the pencil is a good solution. And the other thing I've done, you know, when I have a beginner in person, is I've taken like a wooden dowel, and you can put like a washer at the end of it to kind of simulate that weight, but, you know, 12 inches rather than, I don't know how long a bow is, and then have them practice with that. And that's a really good intermediate step also, from the pencil to the bow, and just to really do it incrementally. And then the other thing you can do is you can have them hold the bow first at the balance point, and that kind of takes the weight out of it. And then gradually, as they get used to that, you move it back towards the frog. But of course, that doesn't work if you're teaching German bow. So, you know, it's just there's always issues that arise with anything.
Right. Hey, I loved your article in the latest Bass World, Game Changer, right? And I had the magazine near me. I can't remember where I put it here, but it was great. So wonderful article, by the way. And then also it was really cool to see some good Chicago representation. I think I turned the page after yours, after your article, and Bill Harrison had an article who is in Chicago. He's in the South Loop. And then I think I flipped a couple back, and Randy Kurtz's Body and Bass, and he's in Chicago. Chicago too. So it's pretty cool. But yeah, it was really cool to check that out.
Yeah, thank you. It was it was a challenging year with my class kind of been being thrown into this situation where we didn't have a language in common, and then the pandemic hit, and but I'll also say that this class of bass players has been my best class of beginners ever. And I think, a lot of the strategies that I tried with them could work with any student. And so, hopefully when we're back to normal at some point, I'll be able to see how that actually works.
When did you get connected with Merit? And maybe we can describe what Merit is too. I have a long tangential association with Merit too. So I love the place.
Oh, yeah.
Great mission, but yeah.
Yeah, I think they're doing fabulous work. They're a nonprofit in Chicago that offers free or reduced costs lessons and orchestra and all kinds of different programs to students in Chicago and the surrounding area. And typically our students in the schools might not otherwise have access to any type of music education. There's no orchestra really in CPS elementary schools unless a particular principal finds it important. And so we're really filling in a gap in students' education. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
No, just about. And then when did you get connected with it?
I've been working with them since, basically since the first year I was in Chicago. So 2013, 2014, somewhere in there. And so I started at DePaul, and then for grad school, and then a couple of weeks later I applied for this job on just a whim, and I got it. And I started out working with their conservatory program, which is geared towards a pre-college student, and they offer orchestra and a little bit of theory, things that would maybe prepare you for that first year of conservatory, if that's the route you're choosing to go. And then after that, at some point, we started this program in this one elementary school. And so I've been teaching the bass players out there for a couple years now.
That's cool. That's great. It's a great program. The founder of that program, Monaco is her last name, and I'm blanking on her first name, but I remember Monaco because her son Tony Monaco is a bass player and still around Chicago, I think. Yeah, but it was so cool. I remember subbing in the late '90s for Judith Hanna, who was teaching at Merit, or maybe this was early 2000s, and they used to be in the old Dearborn station at Dearborn and Polk. This old train station. They were in the lower level, real grungy kind of space. And then sometime in the late 2000s, maybe mid 2000s, they had this wonderful facility built in the West Loop, which has been fun. And I guess I remember going to that facility when Kate Nettleman used to teach at Merit. This is like mid 2000s. She was teaching there for a while. And I think the last couple times I've been there was just we would rehearse in that hall, quite a nice hall actually that they have in that facility. So it's a cool organization.
It's actually a wonderful space. Mm-hmm. The kids are really lucky to get to play in there, and I've made some recordings in there that are just just for various things over the years, and it's really a beautiful space. Mm-hmm. Great acoustics, Mm-hmm. It's easy to sound good in that room.
What gave you the idea to, and I love that you've been getting on every weekday and doing these morning warm-ups. Did that pop in your mind right away when this all hit, or how'd that idea come to mind?
I decided when this all happened, I was going to just try some new things. And I tried to figure out what were some things I could do right away that would benefit the bass community, that people might be able to learn something from, that you could do maybe regardless of your, uh, you know, playing ability. So if you were a beginner, you could a lot of the exercises we do in there can be scaled back. So if we're doing a 3-octave scale, you can do a 1-octave scale 3 times, things like that. And so I try to give examples of how you might do that if you are following along. And over time, there's some different scales. We've done string crossings, things that everyone does, but each day we might be tuning into a different aspect of that and just raising our awareness of what's actually happening while we're executing the technique. So, and that was just like, oh, I can stream this on Facebook. So it was something that was easy to implement rather than, a lot of people have been publishing like really awesome exercises and stuff. And I didn't want to necessarily invest in, notation software and then figure out all the, a PDF or any of that. And I thought, Facebook kind of low budget, but I just wanted to experiment with that and see what would happen.
No, it's great. It's a great way to do it. I always feel like a doofus every time I do a Facebook Live. I haven't done one in years, I think, because I just always what a cool, what a great thing to offer, and then what a good habit to get into as well. One of those that seems like one of those good habits that can transfer over once you aren't trapped at home, teaching online all the time.
Right. And, I don't know how long I'll be able to continue to do it. It's, there is some planning involved, in terms of what, like this week where I have a couple string crossing patterns that we're, building up slowly, and the third variation on that is just a little bit tricky, and so I've got to practice that. And then I'm thinking about, how can a beginner do this as well? Just things like that do require a little bit of forethought and planning. Bowings, how many scales are we going to do in a day? What are they going to be? How does this apply in, the repertoire, things like that. So.
Well, and in that article, you mentioned Caroline Emery's Bowworks, which is a magnificent resource. Mm-hmm. And I was actually just chatting with Caroline a couple times over the last few weeks. When did you discover that book? How did that come onto your radar?
I can't remember the first time I heard her name, but I've been aware of her teaching just from various people over the last few years. And then I was at Domaine Forget this past summer, and I think Paul talked about this book basically nonstop and how great it was and how it was going to change everyone's playing. And I think in a lot of ways that's true, in that even if people were already doing these things, they weren't necessarily thinking about it in the way she lays it out in the book with the curves and awareness of where the string crossing happens and all that. And just having that knowledge as a 10-year-old versus as a 25-year-old, I think is going to make a big difference for the next generation of players and what they're able to do.
What was it like? I've always wanted to visit Domain. Probably my days of actually being a participant there are probably long past me. But maybe going and being a fly on the wall back, whenever we can do such things again. What was it like? I've had a bunch of students do it over the years. I know a lot of the different faculty, but it seems like an interesting kind of a different environment from a lot of other summer camps. I don't know. Summer camps may be the wrong word, but
Yeah, I would say a lot of festivals are really focused on orchestra or, just more of what the collective is doing. And Domain is much more individually focused. So a lot of people showed up and said, well, I really just want to figure out how to do this one thing. And in that way, it's kind of like being at like the bass playing spa, every single one of those teachers is about releasing tension.
mm-hmm.
And so by the time you leave, you'll have no tension left in your playing after 4 weeks of Paul Ellison and all those guys just like pointing out to you where you're working too much and where you're pressing and not using your weight. And then as you build that awareness and you start to find those things on your own. So I think in some ways, it really changed my playing just in 4 weeks from, I changed my setup. I, changed my bow hold slightly, and just these little tweaks, even in, fabulous musicians, you can hear a difference immediately. And just being there, and a thing they did almost everybody was, if you show up sitting with your big stool and whatever, they have you stand up and play, and it's just amazing the difference in the sound right away. Mm-hmm. And the difference in the way the instrument speaks, and allowing the instrument to speak rather than controlling the way the instrument speaks. And just all these tiny tweaks in language and mindset and pressing versus weight, by the end of the summer, you feel like you have a lot to work on.
Yeah, what a great experience. I mean, I've learned so much, not in as intense a setting or a focused setting probably, but and it's helped my playing a lot, learning kind of like I think releasing tension is that's a great way to put a lot of those folks that I know teach there. But boy, do I have a hard time translating that over to my teaching. And I feel like such a failure sometimes when I'm working with students. I see them lock in, and I'm like always trying to find ways to get them to unlock, whether it's my adult students, my teenage students. Has it changed your teaching as well? And I mean, we were talking about bow games. Obviously, that's a great way to sort of introduce some of those concepts of just being a little more natural with your body or free. But like, how did some of what you learned there affect the way you maybe work with younger students, more beginner students?
Well, I'm going to plug my warm-up class again.
Well, that's where yeah, please.
Everyone should watch my warm-up class. As long as it's online, there's 62 to choose from. And, there's just a ton of exercises in there that even before we pick up the bass, we're aiming to arrive at the bass from a very relaxed mindset and point of view. And we're never just going to go in there and just start pounding. which I know everyone loves to do, and it's a lot of fun. But your pounding will sound so much better if you just come to it from a different perspective. So I think the language I use with the beginners is is directed towards that goal. So I never use the word grip. So it's a bow hold. You don't grip your bow. You hold your bow. You you know, just reminding the kids to be gentle. Some of the motions that we do, I'm going to stand up so I can show you. Like here, your arms are just hanging. So then if you start to do a little bit more than that, if you have a bow in your hand, this is enough to bow a bass from the frog to the middle. And that's how relaxed you can be. And just finding small little exercises like that to start every class, even with beginners, I think it prepares them to play with the habits you want. And then we do all kinds of games because when kids are playing, they're relaxed. So if it's a game, they're not worried about, doing it the fastest or the, whatever they have in, whatever preconception they have. And I think also just building that in from day one. Like I talked about in my article, asking the students if they like the sound. So if I'm playing for them and I'm playing with in a relaxed way, and I'm making the most beautiful sound I can on an open D string, they're going to want to do the same. So if that doesn't work, if they say they like the sound, even though it's not a good sound, then you say, does it sound like my sound? And then they have to answer no, and then you can get them that way. But just always, like, the sound will reveal whether or not they're forming a good habit. Like, we can hear immediately when there's that crunchiness, which I can't stand. So just it's really, I think, an awareness thing more than anything. If they're aware of what it sounds like when you press versus what it sounds like when you don't press, then they're always going to want the sound that isn't pressed.
And that the exercise you're demonstrating, which I've heard, like a gorilla pose, kind of is how I've heard, at least when I've been in a class with Paul Ellison talking about that. I love that exercise. I was doing that back in October at a teacher in-service workshop up in Seattle, and had the whole room swinging back and forth. And I've been in such rooms, over the years, and it's really, and making games out of some of those fundamental motions is just so helpful. That's super cool that you've been doing that for 62 and counting sessions. And now you've got this, are you calling it a course, Beginning Bass Online? Is that in July here?
We're gonna try to do just a beginner class and see what happens with it. And I've never started a student from scratch online, really. Like, they've always come to me from orchestra, but I think with a little bit of help from the parent in the first session, and the games I already have in my little teaching toolkit, that we'll be able to have fun. And I also think there's a lower entry cost to start in a group class. And so I want I want music education to be available to everyone. And so I think this is a good way to give students a short opportunity to explore that in a time when, lots of camps aren't running. So that, it's also an experiment, as we all are doing right now, right?
Yeah, well, I will obviously link up to that and send folks that way, and I hope they check it out. And I mean, the group setting for if we go back to Suzuki and before that too, but certainly with Suzuki, I remember sitting in the 90s in some of my Suzuki classes at Northwestern, watching these 5-year-olds all working together, and it's really cool. So you're framing it as age 8 through 12. That's who you're looking for?
Yes,
Nice.
I think in person, I might start a younger student, but I think online, I want them to be able to read for sure, like really well. And I want them to have some of the motor skills already that they need. And just the younger students haven't all developed that, like if you think about when we learn cursive, it's like second grade. And that's because that's when you have the motor skills to do cursive. Although I don't know if kids even learn cursive anymore. Like they learn to type, right?
I'm curious. Somebody out there knows with kids, probably. Yeah.
Someone will write in like.
When did you get interested in working with students of this age? Was that something that you did that happen when you were in Chicago? Before then, how did you get interested in that?
I always believed that was the way to do it because I was actually a violinist before I was a bass player, and I was sort of in my mind like, how come we can start a violinist at age 3, but we can't start a bass player at age 3, or no one does, or and people were doing it. I just wasn't aware of it at the time. But I think there's something, you can start those kids, and it just takes longer for them to develop the skills you're looking for. But really, like, so many people I admire have been doing that for such a long time that I just wasn't aware of it, but I never had any notion like they shouldn't, or anything like that.
When did you switch to, I started on violin too. I switched over when I switched over when I was 13. I remember my first lesson was with my middle school or junior high, I think it was at the time, orchestra director, and she was a violinist. And I remember both of us were like, this instrument's impossible. When did you make that switch?
Well, I played some bass in like the high school jazz band just because I was like really interested in the music. But I didn't really switch or, do anything with it until I was in college. And I was doing an education degree, and, just, I heard this recital and I was like, wow, that is just the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. I have to do it. And so I switched, and just for sheer force of will, like I think picked it up very quickly. But I think for sure the understanding of a string instrument and the way it worked certainly helped there. So
do you still play any violin? Is that
only to like own like a ninth grader, like like they come in, they haven't practiced, and you're like, oh, you didn't practice this? Let me see if I can do it. And then I play it, then I hand their violin back like, oh, you better practice that. So
It was funny to pick. Like for me, I switched over at 13, so much younger than you. And so then when I started teaching high school orchestra back 2009 or something like that, I learned the value of playing violin in a context like that, because like playing bass is not the most useful for demonstrating in a just a regular orchestra class or. But I was coming back to it as like a bassist, it's like, what is this little thing, and working on it. But it was really interesting spending some time actually trying to practice violin and move around on violin. And it was sort of depressing to me. I remember the point where I realized, I can actually play faster on violin than I can on bass at this point, just because it's just such a different experience. And I sound better.
Yeah, when you think like the whole fingerboard is like the distance, from like the open string to like a D on the on the G string, like it's a fifth. It's their whole fingerboard.
Well, it's just so interesting because I realized I was almost, this sounds weird, but I was almost thinking faster on the violin. I mean, I was not playing violin well, but I was practicing it, an hour a day, hour and a half or something, and I obviously practice a lot of stringed instruments. So I don't know, it just made me think a lot about how different the experience of playing bass is. In both hands, it sort of gave me a little more empathy for people that are, students on the bass or coming to the bass. And I sort of forget, as someone who's been playing bass for 30 years or more, maybe at this point, how physical the instrument really is, and how staying relaxed is just a different challenge, I think, on an instrument like the bass than the violin. It's hard to be relaxed on any instrument, but we just have some, I think some special factors.
Right. I wonder too if it's two thoughts. Have you ever put your bass in the wrong hand and tried to play it?
Yeah, that's
because I do that every time I go to teach something to a beginner. I'm trying to figure out how it feels to them to do it for the first time, and just to do it backwards is, I think, the best way to approximate that, because this hand doesn't know how to do this, and this hand has a hopeless bow hold. And then I wonder too if part of it is like, because you are developing those skills on violin as a child, if there's something to that, like the brain plasticity you would have had at that point. And, if it's just so deeply ingrained that you're able to get back to it much easier.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's endlessly fascinating. And it's cool that you moved over to bass when you did. Bass, this is just my crackpot theory, but there are some instruments where people go on and have professional careers, whether it's performing or teaching or whatever, making a switch in college or something like that. Violin is not an instrument I've heard a lot of people switching to and finding success, but like I was just on a call with Scott Pingle just before we were chatting. Principal bass of San Francisco Symphony, switched in college, or like 17 or 18 or something. I know a lot of musicians that have done that on bass. And I think about some of the other non-string instruments. I know a lot of wind players that started to really get serious, like senior year of high school, went on to have professional careers. I wonder if there's something about violin, or perhaps violin and maybe a high level of classical piano or something, where that plasticity, if that's the word, it's like it's so required for those motions. I don't know. That's my theory.
Yeah, and I wonder if that will change as we start to train students younger. Like if you look at like Kevin Brown, I have never heard him mess anything up, and he started when he was very young. And I wonder if there's other examples of players like that. Probably there's some kids from like Tracy Rowell's studio who are now entering college and 100% just play fantastically.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people that are like right around late 20s, early 30s that like Nina DeCaesar is a great example. Someone who studied with George Vance, people that some of the first people to play on those little basses, get trained. Ted Botsford is another example, and L.A. Phil, Kevin Brown, a lot of people that it's interesting. So I do wonder, because if we rewind to what violin looked like in the 50s, maybe that's what bass is starting to, or I think it has started to make that change. So it'll be interesting. I was talking to Johnny Hamill on Friday, who's another young bass education advocate, and he was saying, within our lifetimes, we're going to see the Bach First Suite on the bass be a middle school piece, which is crazy for me to think, but because I played that on my senior college recital, not that well.
Right.
But I also think, I just watched Nina DeCaesar on Instagram, I think, go through and play every single movement of every Bach suite,
Yeah.
So, and somebody who studied with George Vance and, started at a young age, like we're talking about. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what the next generation of people, what the generation of people starting the age that you're starting people at will look like.
Yeah, well, I mean, even now, like all my high schoolers do Bach. Like there's no excuse for not, even if they just do, 8 measures, that's part of our lesson every week is just some kind of Bach. And, a couple, there's movements in the suites that are really accessible. And there's also pieces like in that George Vance second volume that you can use to teach all the style, and they live in that kind of second position kind of area. And I just think everyone should play Bach because it's just such great music.
Yeah. Well, it's cool what you're doing, Sara. This is actually not your first time on the podcast. You were on a little bit at one of those Chicago bass festivals from a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
But this is the first time we got to sit down on the mic, so I appreciate it. And I'll link up to your website, Facebook, Instagram, anywhere else you want me to send folks?
No, I think that covers it. If there's anything else that I start doing in the interim, I'm sure it'll be on all those locations. So.
And again, those locations can all be found in the show notes for this episode, or go to contrabasic.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you follow along regardless of whether you are a beginning bassist, which might be unlikely. I don't know how many 8 to 12-year-olds listen to podcasts, but if you do, that's awesome. But if you know somebody who has a child that age, or you have a child yourself that age and are looking to get them into bass, what a cool way to do it. And yeah, that's all I got to say. Thank you for listening. I appreciate everybody who listens to this podcast. It totally freaks me out still when I meet people who've listened to any of these, really, but especially people who have followed along for a long time. So if you've been doing that, thank you. You rock. I appreciate it. The team appreciates it. We'll have more production on future episodes, but I just wanted to get the message out for this. And I've had like 19 cups of coffee, which is why I'm talking so fast. So I am signing off, and we will see you again soon for more Life on the Low End of the Spectrum.